Welcome everyone to the Maudlin boat race event. We're delighted to see you joining in. And as you can see, I'm at Hammersmith Bridge, which you can see the trilates going underneath. And it's Hammersmith Bridge which has stopped the boat race being in its normal location this year. It is in fact taking place on Sunday on the River Ouse at Ely. The reason being that Hammersmith Bridge, which was opened by the Duke of Sussex in 1825, was closed in October to all vehicle traffic and river traffic. So we can't row underneath it any longer. But members of Maudlin who have rowed in the boat race will all have rowed under Hammersmith Bridge. And I'd like to introduce now Susanna Cass, Patrick Elwood, and Daphne Marchenko, who are wearing their blues blazers earned in very hard races against Oxford. Perhaps I can hand over to you, Susanna, to explain to us how you came to rowing, what you're doing now, and a little bit about the intervening years.
Thanks, Pat. Hello, everyone. So yes, I'm Susanna. I was one of those many people who arrived at Maudlin with a vague idea of what a boat looked like, and having watched the boat race on the television through my childhood, but never really dreamed of ending up at Oxford or Cambridge, and certainly never dreaming of ending up in a boat race. Turned up at the boathouse in my first term here as a very uncoordinated, terrible at all forms of field sports and ball sports, sort of not generally sporty person, and somehow sort of found that this thing where you sit on the water and pull on a stick actually sort of suited me, and being quite tall was quite useful, and sort of found my sport, and got into rowing here, and was taught by other rowers who were younger than me how to get on with it and how to learn. And then went on by my third year to row in the boat race, and carried on with rowing after that through my graduate studies as well. And then it's led me to some rather strange adventures. Learnt to love rowing and ended up rowing across 2 oceans, doing a race halfway across the Pacific to Hawaii, and across the Atlantic, trying to join up Olympic host cities. And now I'm back in Cambridge, back in Maudlin, as a coach now. And well, it's been a bit of a quiet year, but back looking after Maudlin Boat Club's rowers, and looking forward to getting them all back on the water very soon, and to future successes for MBC, and hopefully feeding some of them forward to CUWBC in the future as well.
Thanks. Patrick, would you like to take over from here?
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Patrick. So I matriculated at Maudlin in 2012, which feels like a long time ago right now, for undergrad. Straight out of school, kind of did nat ski, very, very standard. I actually rowed at a local club before I came whilst I was at school. Not to a particularly high standard, but, you know, knew what I was doing when I came here. Didn't row for the first year because I had a pretty bad back injury. After that, I started kind of getting back into a boat midway through my second year, and then trialed in my third year of undergrad, which then, so I trialed for 4 years, the last 2 years of my undergrad, and then the first 2 years of the PhD, which I'm at the moment in the process of writing up after many COVID-related delays. So then, yeah, in 2018 was in the Blue Boat, which we won, which was obviously for me kind of the absolute peak. And I think after that, I knew the time was right to kind of step away and go out on a high and move on to other things. So I'm kind of doing a bit of competitive kind of like triathlon and cycling at the moment, just for enjoyment, really. But yeah, I think for me it was just the time was right. I need to finish my PhD and do something else. So yeah.
And Daphne?
Thank you, Pat. Hi, everyone. It's so lovely to be here. I'm Daphne Marchenko. I was at Maudlin, matriculated in 2015, and was a rower on the open weight Cambridge squad in 2015, 2016, and then in 2018. But I started my rowing journey in the United States. I was a part of my state school rowing team. And much to everyone's surprise, took to it. I was a very unathletic child who hated sport generally, so finding rowing was a gift in many ways. And then went on to Stanford University, where I rowed there as well throughout my undergrad, and was a part of the under 23 national team for the United States in 2012 and 2014. And then came to Cambridge for an MPhil in education, and loved it so much that I stayed on for a PhD. So graduated in 2019, July of 2019. And I was the first person of color to row in the Oxford-Cambridge boat race in 2015. It was also a very historic year. It was the first women's boat race on the Tideway. And in 2018, I was able to proudly finish my rowing career as president of CUWBC, where we had a clean sweep for the men and women's program. So it was a really wonderful, wonderful year. And now I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Stanford Center for Biomedical Ethics, so I've returned back to my old stomping grounds, and I'm staying connected to rowing through more nonprofit type of work. I'm on a number of grant committees working to fund youth rowing programs that are working with groups that are historically underrepresented in the sport of rowing, and really thankful that I still get to have rowing be a very central part of my life. So happy to be here.
Thanks, Daphne. And I'm Pat Marsh. I'm a Fellow-Commoner at Maudlin, and a former chairman of Cambridge University Women's Boat Club, founder member of the Ospreys, and on the Hawks Club charitable trust. And I am absolutely nuts about rowing, and it's enriched my life. The audience will have the opportunity to submit questions by clicking on the question and answer button at the bottom of the toolbar during the session, and those will be taken later. So if I can start the questioning by asking everyone, did you come from any rowing schools or any rowing dynasties? We seem to have whole families who encourage rowing. And I just wondered if any of you had that sort of background. Patrick, perhaps you'd like to start.
Yeah, thanks, Pat. So I went to a state school, which I think very few state schools that I know of in the UK row. Definitely very, very few row to any competitive standard. But my mum was actually at Cambridge in the 80s, and so she rowed in the reserve race, which is Blondie is the Cambridge crew and Osiris is the Oxford crew for the women's boat club. I think 86, it was mid-80s sometime, I can't remember exactly. And obviously, you know, that just kind of instills this kind of inquisitiveness as a child. And, you know, we'd watch the boat race every year on TV, and obviously she'd support Cambridge. And I think that just kind of had my interest just peaked. And so I wanted to give it a go, and I was never very good at ball sports. You know, I enjoy playing rugby and stuff like that, but I was never particularly great at them, as I'm sure is possibly the case for Daphne and Susanna as well, by the sound of things. And yeah, so I, at about 15, I started, you know, rowing at a local club. My parents loosely knew some people who were involved, so kind of got chatting. People at that club, actually, one of my very early coaches at that club, who I kind of owe a lot of thanks to, he was at Cambridge in the 60s, and he just missed out on being selected for the Blue Boat at a time when there was no reserve boat. The men's reserve boat's called Goldie. So he never actually got to officially represent Cambridge in a way he would have done if he'd have been there 10 years later when there was a reserve race for the men. And then one of the girls who I kind of started rowing with at that time at the club, she's now on the GB national team. She rowed, you know, she won the Olympic pairs trials last year, obviously before the Olympics was cancelled. So she's, you know, the top 2 rowers in the country. So, you know, there's kind of it's not a traditional kind of public school, kind of like Eton, St. Paul's rowed, came to Cambridge, rowed in the boat race beginning, just because, you know, I went to a state school and I think there aren't the same opportunities. So I kind of just took a different path, which I guess is just a bit more uncommon, but obviously I would love to see that open up for more people, because I just think it's just not something you do if you go to a state school, unless there's some other reason. Whereas when you go to a public school, it's kind of just there for you. So like Daphne, I just like to see more opportunities for people who kind of go to state schools or from slightly disadvantaged backgrounds to get into the sport, really.
Daphne, what do you think?
Yeah. So in the United States, I think it's a little bit more common for state schools to have rowing clubs, especially on the East Coast. And so I was very lucky. I grew up in the state of Virginia, not too far from Washington, D.C. And my state school had a rowing club that was very young at the time, had only been around for a couple of years, and we were really quite terrible. Nothing to brag about, but it was you know, a wonderful introduction to the sport, and I had an incredible novice coach who continues to be a mentor to me in my life. And it was life-changing in many ways, but, you know, neither of my parents rowed. They were both immigrants to the United States. There was, you know, no history of rowing. It was something that I had never heard about at all, and I just came across it very randomly. I was actually quite into theater when I was in school and was on my way to Washington, D.C. for a Shakespeare theater competition, and I looked out as we were crossing the Potomac River and saw some crews out on the water, and it just looked so interesting and fascinating, and I asked if anyone knew what these strange looking boats were on the water, and someone explained it to me. And so, you know, I decided that the following year I was going to try rowing and join my school's rowing club, and I never looked back. So I don't come from a rowing dynasty, but, you know, I hope that I will be the start of a future rowing dynasty, so to speak.
Susanna?
Yeah, so I think I sort of slightly mentioned as well, similar to Patrick, that we didn't have rowing at school. I grew up not far, just down the road from Blondie Boat Club and some of the sort of most prestigious clubs, UK rowing clubs. I did very briefly wander into Blondie Boat Club and got sort of forgotten on an erg on a rowing machine for about half an hour, and I think then they came back and remembered I was there, but I'm not sure they were really looking for juniors at the time. So I didn't make it into rowing until I got here, and yeah, I'm glad I did find it. I'm similar. I was a sort of much more into theatre and those kind of things at school as well. So I'm not sure I nearly didn't make it past my first Michaelmas term. I'm not much of a morning person, so I sort of was pretty convinced that after Christmas I was probably not gonna head back to the river. I'd done my novice term and that was that. And luckily our lower boats captains, the LBCs, very cleverly convinced us all that we were individually doing really well, and that we should come back, and we've been selected to be the Maudlin senior, like the W1 crew in the next term. But it turned out really that there was just no one else that wanted to row that term, so all the novices automatically became W1, and found ourselves racing the women's head of the river on the tideway about halfway through our second ever term of rowing, and finished 300 and something. So we're just really glad to get to the end of it without sinking. So it was a slow start, but enough to get hooked, and that was no looking back from there. But also it's something I completely agree with everyone has said, that there ought to be more opportunities. And we've all said that it's something that's a sport that caters for people who aren't necessarily the great, or don't see themselves as the greatest sports people in other ways. So it should be accessible, because it suits people that maybe don't find roles in other sports.
I think whoever convinced you that you should stay rowing, Susanna, did a really good job, because the year that you rowed, there were 3 Maudlin women in the boat, the only time ever. For the men, in 1840, they had 3 Maudlin men in the blue boat. What do you attribute that to? 3 Maudlin women in the boat. Did you have an inspirational background here? You know, were people very supportive?
A lot of it was probably pure luck. Some of it comes down to Jenny, who was our one of our lower boats captains. She was one of the 3 of us, so she can probably take the most credit out of all of us, because she taught us to row one year, and then 2 years later we were all trialing together. Partly it was that bad luck, or not necessarily bad luck, but that sort of being the only people keen to row that Lent term. We just forged a really strong bond together. We'd all started from exactly the same place. We were all complete beginners. We were complete underdogs. I think we went down 6 in the Lent bump. So I've got a spoon from the maze. we had a very unsuccessful first year, but enough that kept us together and stuck together. That we sort of understood. We had really good support in our second year of rowing, from an excellent coach who coached all of the Maudlin crews, Andy Neild. But he was an excellent coach and brought us along technically in a really sort of short space of time. So we got to a point where we could feasibly consider trialing for the university. And we had a lot of support from college and from alumni, people like Richard Hammersley, the president then, who were just really enthusiastic and sort of gave us the idea that we could consider those things that we hadn't considered trialing, we hadn't considered potentially rowing for the university. So yeah, it was mostly just a really good boat club spirit, I think, that sort of kept us going and pushed us through it.
Great. And what does everyone think, and how did you find the training program for the Blue Boat? It's a program of pain, physical pain with blisters and aches and pains, and mental pain with endurance, seat racing, and the start of the boat race. Patrick, would you like to say what your training program was and how you felt about it?
Sorry, a classic, left myself muted there. So like as a very loose overview, we would have Mondays off, train in the gym at 6:30 till 9, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday morning. We'd then row at Ely Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday afternoon. So we'd leave at 1:30, get back at 5:30 or 6, depending on traffic and how long the session was and how much faff there was, etc. Friday afternoon would normally be like a session in your own time, which was just kind of to allow everyone to kind of fit stuff in around their schedules. And then both weekend days was double rows at Ely in the morning. So we'd leave at 7:30 and we'd get back at maybe 2:30 or 3. So in terms of time, it was a lot of time, I think. looking back on it now, I kind of think, how on earth did I fit that in? But when you're doing it, it just forces you to be efficient with everything else in your life. There's no, when you don't have the time to sit there twiddling your thumbs, half working, half browsing the internet, you just get on with it and you don't really have a choice. I think for me, and I actually think for a lot of people, that people think of it as like very physically grueling, which, don't get me wrong, it is. And I'm sure Susanna and Daphne will agree with me there. Like, it is hard work. It is uncomfortable. It is tiring and everything like that. And I think everyone there, they wouldn't be doing it if they didn't, to an extent, enjoy that part of it. Like, yes, it's hard, but that also makes it very rewarding. And yeah, there are times when you're driving out to Ely at 1:30 on a Thursday and you're very tired and you just can't be bothered, and you're just like, oh, I just can't be bothered with this. Why am I doing this? But I think the bit which is less obvious is just the emotional stress that it puts you under with, selection, your own performance, and you go through times when you're just not performing that well. You don't necessarily know why, and you always come out of that the other side. But I think for me, the hardest bit is just the constant pressure and stress and feeling that you're constantly being assessed by the coaches, you're constantly being assessed by people you're rowing with, everything's timed, everything's recorded, and there's not the opportunity to really have a bad day, it feels, because that could be the day that the decisions are made or based on or whatever. So I think that's the side of it for me, that the physical side is obvious really, but the emotional endurance that you have to kind of put up with during that 6-7 month trialing period is not necessarily very obvious, but for me was probably the harder of the two sides really. So yeah, I'm not sure what the other two, Daphne and Susanna, think of that, but yeah, that's my take on it.
I agree with that, absolutely. And I think that I love that you called it a program of pain, Pat, because that's very accurate. But while rowing might take away from your time with respect to being able to spend time with friends or family, going on training camps right after the holidays, at least was always challenging for me because my family was living in the US and I could only go home for a very short amount of time and then had to come back. But I truly believe that it gave so much more than it ever took away from me. And, even now, although I'm not rowing out in a boat every morning, I found that the discipline and the time management that Patrick talked about, that is something that I carry with me to this day. And I, the boat races training program really puts in a lot of structure. You have to be very good with your time. And even now, I try and build in that same structure. So I, at the start of every week, I plan out almost every hour of my day that upcoming week, put in when I'm going to work out, put in when I'm going to do my reading, when I'm going to write, because I found that having that level of structure is what allows me to get things done in an efficient, productive manner. And so I just think that the training program, in the moment, it teaches you a lot about resilience and grit, but even afterwards, you still are taking those lessons and applying them to your everyday life. And I think that it's something that I feel so fortunate to have had, and so many people, will not get the opportunity to be in such an intense environment with people who are so aligned in their goal and their mission. And it's something that I miss, and I know that while I'm very lucky to have had that experience, in some ways it's also really hard because now you've had it and you don't get that anymore. It's just very special.
And I think that Susanna must have felt the same because she's come back. What are your thoughts, Susanna?
Yeah, I'd say I was thinking I wish I'd learned the lessons quite as well as Daphne has, because I'm not sure I could claim that I've kept that amount of time management in in my life. But maybe that's why I've carried on with coaching, because it gives me that routine and that schedule and blocked out parts of my day again. I remember at the time my final year was the one year that I trialed, and my grades improved. It was easier to work harder academically because that was the only two things I was doing in my life. I know I mean, I rode a fair bit before either of you guys, so we had a different boathouse, and the traditionally there's been a bit of a difference in the schedule that the men's and women's sides of the squad have worked on. So we were always out early in the morning getting the 5:55 train out and coming back by train for our 9 o'clock lectures, and not training so much in the afternoons. So it was sort of different ways of scheduling, but having only those two focuses for my final year was definitely actually really helpful academically, and kind of carried on as well. And then, as Patrick was saying, with the sort of, I completely agree that the mental side and that the sort of resilience that it takes to sort of know that you're being watched the whole time was probably definitely one of the biggest lessons that I learned from my year of trialing. That sort of just grit and just sort of sticking with it. I think it is tough to question yourself for that long, but yeah, the rewards, if you can stick with it, are huge.
Yeah, I actually think it's really interesting what Daphne said about it not it's such a positive thing. I think a lot of people describe it as, oh, you must sacrifice so much, you have to give up so much to do it, but you don't fit. I don't like describing it as a sacrifice, because I'm choosing to be there. I want to be there. If I didn't want to be there, I fundamentally wouldn't be there. So it's actually a privilege to be there. And I don't think it really counts as sacrificing. You're doing something instead that I think is very rewarding and is tough at times, absolutely. But I think to describe the training program as a sacrifice is, to me at least, misleading, because it's not. It's a huge privilege to be able to do that and to go through that with the people in the team and everything. That I don't see it as a sacrifice that I had to give up a social life for 6 months of the year, because I got a social life from rowing as well, and stuff like that. So I think it's important to say that, yeah, it is hard, but you're there because you want to be there, and fundamentally you get an awful lot out of it. So I don't think you sacrifice anything to be there. And I think it was very, like, when Daphne said what he said earlier, that made me think of that I've never spoken to that about that to someone else before, but I think clearly Daphne was kind of thinking the same thing there, that it's actually it's a huge privilege to be there, and just because you can't do things doesn't mean you're sacrificing anything, if that makes sense.
And to pick up something that Susanna said, that your grades improved, there's a misconception in the academic world that if you do elite sport, it will harm your academic results. But this last year, Graham Virgo, who's the Pro Vice Chancellor for Education, initiated this massive study where they analysed the TRIPOS results from 2005 to 2016, and the blues and half blues, there were 4,000. And when they compared the blue and half blue results with the TRIPOS as a whole, the blues and half blues got a significantly higher number of firsts and 2 ones. So remarkable, really. It's, there is a myth that sport harms academic results. But what about mental health? Does it improve? Daphne?
Oh, that's such a challenging question, because I think it does both. So, we talked about how rowing helps with developing your resilience, your grit, your mental fortitude. But, at least from my personal experience, I think injury is something that can be very difficult to deal with. We all talked about how with trialing, you are always having to perform and you're on on. You have to be on all the time. And when you are suffering from an injury, that is taken away from you. And I think that mentally can be very difficult. And, when I had a back injury in 2018, and unfortunately it ended my rowing career. And I would say that was very tough for me to accept. And so I guess I would say that rowing has given so many skills with mental strength, but I also think that sometimes the flip side of that is that we don't always listen to our bodies and know when we need to rest and recover. We feel this pressure to perform and to push through and to show your strength and endurance physically. So I guess I'd say both, but absolutely, as I mentioned before, the lessons that I've taken away from rowing are all lessons related to the psychological skills that I've gained as a function of being a rower, and those are the ones that I'm applying in my life every day. It's not the physical strength that I got from rowing is not there to the extent that it was when I was trialing, but the mental skills absolutely are still a part of it. And I think that's just a testament to, when Patrick talked about how challenging it can be mentally to go through the trialing process. That is also, like we said, a gift and something that is going to far surpass any lasting effects of any physical gains that you might get from the trialing experience.
Yeah, I also think Daphne's spot on with the injury point, and it's not just injury, is it? It's there are points when you might physically not be injured, but it's just not going well for you. Things aren't falling into place with your own performance or how your boats are going or whatever. And I think the things I wanted to add to that is that it's not an environment where it's very I don't know about the women's side. I wasn't part of the women's squad, but on the men's side, for sure, it's not very easy to show weakness because you're there to race and you're there to win. And that's the only reason anyone is there. And that's the only thing that really matters to anyone there. So it's not, and I think this is only actually something I've realized afterwards, in the couple of years afterwards, when mental health has been talked about a lot more. And it's, would I have felt comfortable in the squad environment putting my hand up and saying I'm struggling? I don't think I would have done, because it's an environment that, it's an environment that rewards strength. And now it's very easy to confuse kind of the fact that if you're struggling with something, that doesn't necessarily mean, or it doesn't mean at all, when you get in a boat, that boat is going to go any slower, which is ultimately the only thing that matters in that environment, is how fast you can make a boat go. But it does, there's a perception, I think, which will improve with time, and I know is improving with time from conversations I've had with people fairly recently, that weakness can't be tolerated, which I think the good thing is that it's moving away from that. But certainly, if I had been struggling with things that I'd have felt like I needed to open up about at the time, I don't think I would have been comfortable. So there are definitely pros and cons to the mental health side of it. The pros are obviously that doing that amount of exercise and discipline is very good for your mental health in many ways, but there are also potential downsides that I think people are becoming more and more aware of as kind of time goes on, really.
I'd say that's something that's quite interesting for me, sort of having switched to the coaching side to recognize parts of that. And I mean, I'm coaching at college boat club level, so a lot of it is teaching people to row for the first time, but that's becoming a huge part of what we do is try to create that culture, which I think even maybe increasingly academically, we're going towards that sort of complete fear of failure, even from schools before you even get to university. And then in that way, the boat clubs where you're catering for a lot of people who've never tried the sport before, and it's a huge opportunity to have complete beginners and to try to create an environment where at least for novices and starting out, it's a completely safe space to come and have a go and fail perfectly happily and enjoy it and learn a new sport and get to enjoy the process rather than being so fixated on scores and results and things like that. And the frustration, even with top level crews, of knowing that someone's trying to hide an injury from you, is sort of just trying to get people to see that bigger picture, that I'd rather you told me now and we sort it out than you break in 3 weeks' time when there's a race the next weekend. So yeah, it's an interesting culture, and it's interesting for me to have changed sides almost, and looking at it in different ways as well.
And for the current crews, with COVID restrictions, and last year, the year before, the boat race was cancelled on the 23rd of March as they were due to row on the 28th. Absolute devastation after that. And are you all keeping in touch with any of the current crews? I know, Daphne, you're doing some remarkable yoga. Would you like to tell us about that?
Yeah, so I talked about how I got injured in 2018 and I ended up having back surgery, and I discovered yoga as a way for me to heal, and I think also to rediscover myself after having rowing be an absent part of my life when it had been something that had defined me for so long. So I, alongside my postdoc, got certified in yoga, being able to teach yoga, and it's been really great to be able to offer yoga through Zoom to members of the women's squad once a week while they're trialing, and it's been really great, I think, for me, and I think for them also. Some of the feedback that I've gotten is that they've just enjoyed having an opportunity to come together without any pressure or expectations, and practice a little bit of mindfulness and reconnect to listening to our bodies, which is, as I've said, I think something that we can sometimes forget to do when we're in the midst of the trialing experience. So I'm grateful that I was able to help the squad in that small way.
Susanna, you're quite in touch with the current squad, and especially Sam Vosper, our current captain, who's training with the Blues.
Yeah, so I had a chance to go out at what seems like a really long time ago now, at the start of the season in sort of October time, and see some of the crews out on the water in Ely. Long before they realised that was actually going to be the stretch of water that they'd be racing on. But it's quite nice to be around here and to check in with them and hear about them racing. So yes, we've got our current captain Sam, who's in the heavyweight or the open weight squad, and we've had some lightweight trialists this year in the men's lightweight squads. Anton is training with them at the moment. It's good to keep in touch with them and to link back and through. It's sort of quite a small world always. I know one of the open weight women's crew, just from rowing when I moved on from Maudlin to Trinity College Dublin, and CUWBC Dempsey was one of the novices that rowed with us and that I coached. So kind of fun linking up people from different bits of rowing careers and seeing them progress through as well.
And do you see Sam Patrick as well and keep in touch?
Yeah, well, I've obviously rowed with Sam for potentially 5 years in May and stuff like that. And he did a master's here when I was in my first year of trialing. So we rowed together at CUWBC for a bit. Then he went away, and then he came back to PhD. So I know Sam quite well. I think I see him fairly regularly and always have a chat and a catch up about how he's doing. And there are a couple of other guys from the current squad who I know from my time rowing. And I think, it's always nice when they, sometimes like ask your opinion or your advice, because I think when you're in that environment, it's so all encompassing. It's like everything is so raw and important and nothing else matters. And then obviously you step away from that, and over a couple of years it puts everything into perspective, and it doesn't necessarily feel like it matters any less, but you get a bit more perspective on what it meant. And I think it's actually been quite nice to, there are a few people this year who I've chatted to, and one of them's had a fairly rough ride of it, which unfortunately, that goes with the territory of elite sport, is that some people are going to have bad years and some people are going to have good years. And it's been nice to be able to just put some perspective on that for him and just say, well, I know right now this feels like the end of the world, but actually it's not the end of the world. And I think it's very easy when you're trying to row in the boat race. I certainly felt like if I didn't win the boat race by the time I left Cambridge, my life was a failure. And that's kind of how I'd framed it in my head. And I think actually looking back, that was probably quite damaging to do that. On the flip side, it kind of pushed me on at the same time. So there's two sides to it, but you realize that however important it is, and it does matter, your life is not going to be defined by whether you win or lose the boat race. My life, having won the boat race, is not an automatic success, whatever else I go on to do. It's nice to look back on, but you move on from that quite quickly. So I think being able to try and give some of that perspective to a few of the guys that I still rode with, who I obviously am quite close with, has been quite nice, really.
Well, we're really proud of all of you for rowing in the boat race. We actually have 10 women from Maudlin who've rowed in the Blue Boat, and exactly 50 men from Maudlin. It's the 166th men's boat race and the 75th women's boat race. But Maudlin women didn't start rowing until 1988, so we were a little bit late in getting our girls in there. We've had an awful lot of questions coming in, so I'm going to start to ask one or two. And the first one is for Susanna. Which was more challenging, training for the boat race or the transatlantic row?
It's quite a hard one. Training for, they're both similar in their sort of relentlessness. Training for the boat race obviously is a much longer period, but it has that similar aspect of you never quite know how long it's going to be. You sign up as a trialist and you're there as long as you stay competitive, and there is that sort of idea in the back of your head that you could be cut, and you've got to sort of keep working to a not completely clear time frame. Obviously you know when the race is, but you don't really know what proportion of that you're going to be training through for. And yeah, rowing oceans is a bit like that as well. You might know what the best estimate is or what other crews have done it in, but at least in my experience, it invariably takes an awful lot longer, and feels, as you get closer and closer to land, it feels longer and longer as well. The last few bits are pretty relentless. So yeah, I think I probably would not have backed myself to do something like that if I hadn't had that experience of really pushing myself physically for quite a prolonged period of time, and for sort of having that bit of resilience that's sort of built up by knowing that you're always trying to perform at that top level and be competitive enough to stay in the squad. So I'm not sure I could judge between the two. Rowing oceans is much more boring. There's some beautiful sights, a good whale and a beautiful sunrise and sunset, but most of the other 12 hours a day that you spend rowing can be pretty boring. At least there's more people to chat to whilst you're trialing. even Ely in its glorious fenland flat boring excitement is slightly more exciting than a flat ocean on a grey day.
Thanks, Susanna. And the first question: why choose Maudlin? Irrespective of rowing, what made you choose the Maudlin as a college? Daphne?
Yes, so when I first came to Cambridge for my MPhil, I actually was at Homerton, and so I made the very conscious decision to then transition to Magdalene for my PhD. And I think there are a number of reasons. I mean, one is I felt very strongly that I wanted to be at a smaller college where there'd be a stronger sense of community, and Magdalene checked that box. But also, you know, all the people that I had met who were at Magdalene had become so near and dear to my heart. You know, Evelyn Bedecker, who was in the Blondie Boat in 2015, is one of my absolute closest friends, and she was at Magdalene doing a PhD, and so I heard about the college through her experiences. And, you know, Pat, you've always been such a mentor in my life, and I knew that you were also at Magdalene, and so I think it was partly, you know, small, like logistical things, like wanting to be in a smaller college than I had been, and wanting to be more in the center of town. But I think more than anything, it was that the people that I had met who were at Magdalene were so central in my life, and had been so supportive, and I felt that was a sign of the kind of community that I would find at Magdalene. So that was my big motivation.
Oh, it's lovely of you to say that. And Patrick?
This is rather embarrassing. I actually applied to Pembroke and got pulled to Magdalene. I didn't want to go to Pembroke anyway, obviously. So no, I mean, I did decide to stay at Magdalene for my PhD, obviously, and that was very similar to Daphne. I think it's kind of the people, really. Like, that's what actually makes a college, and, you know, particularly in my experience, Magdalene, it's like it's not about the building necessarily, or, you know, they're all very nice, but without the people and the friends, and, you know, at Magdalene Boat Club, I still you know, I'll row this maze if it's on as well, so I'm quite actively involved there in the rowing side, and I was more actively involved in kind of the admin side of that in my undergrad. And, you know, people like Perrin, and who gives up a huge amount of his free time to coach, and those people kind of just made me want to stay, really. Like, why would I, when I at Magdalene, when I've got so many friends at Magdalene, why would I go anywhere else? It's kind of obvious, really. At the time, it felt obvious anyway.
Yeah, it was a very similar answer for me. It was the people. I didn't really know much about any of the colleges, visited quite a lot of them on an open day, and the students that showed me around Magdalene made me feel the most at home. And I could imagine spending 3 years of my life living here. Little did I know that it would be an awful lot more than 3 years, at least maybe not quite living in Magdalene, but hanging around very close.
And Patrick, just say a little bit about how Magdalene men are doing now.
Yeah, so when I arrived, things were not great. I think particularly with a small college, there's always going to be ebbs and flows, because it doesn't take that many people to be there or not be there, as the case may be, to cause quite a huge swing in how things are going. And when I came, we were in the second division, and in my first May bump will have been 2014, which was the end of my second year. So we kind of were in the second division, and we got out of the first division then. Got into the first division rather, and then from then we've just kind of kept going up, really. We got Blades 3 years ago. I'm trying to work out when it was with COVID. Everything's very hard to judge. And then the last May, which was before last year, obviously, we started 5th, and so there was always a chance to go head that year. And we actually overbumped to 2nd on the first day, and then on the second day we were about a quarter of a length off bumping to headship, at which point the wheels absolutely fell off, and we got bumped to 3rd, and then on the last day bumped back up to 2nd. So it's been a bit of a turnaround from when I arrived, and you know, I've been incredibly lucky to row through all of those maize campaigns. You know, there are people who have put in an awful lot of work, you know, people like George, who I did undergrad, he was a couple of years behind me and has stayed on living in Cambridge, coaching, and he kind of was effectively head coach of the men's side and has now sort of begun to pass the baton on to Susanna in kind of like this changeover period where they're both doing it a bit just for a bit of continuity, which I think is good. And I think him and Perrin have been incredibly like responsible for that increase over time. And then at various points in that, obviously, we've just been lucky with the rowers that have come along. And you know, actually, after one of the boat races that Oxford won when I was in Goldie, their president actually said, which I remember it very distinctly, he said, "Winning breeds winning, and we know how to win." And at the time, it made me very angry because I just lost the Goldie race and I did not want to hear that. But I think there's an element of truth in that when the club's doing well, it's exciting for people to get involved. So you get more people trying it. There's more enthusiasm. More people who've already rowed will apply to Maudlin. And eventually, you know, I'm sure being a small college, that might run out, whether it's in 2 years or 5 years or 10 years. And that's just part of the process. But for now, it's just very exciting, really, to be a part of that. And it's the joint highest Maudlin men have ever been on the river. So yeah, it's pretty good, to be honest.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's absolutely true. And a question, what's your next boat race? What's your next big challenge or goal? Daphne?
So, yeah, I guess my next big boat race is that I am hoping to become a professor at a university. So my next goal is academic rather than sports related, but I'm hoping that I will become a professor at a medical school sometime in the next 5 years. So that's my next boat race.
Patrick?
I just really would love to finish my PhD, if I'm honest. They're very simple.
And Susanna?
I suppose my next boat races are Maudlin's next boat races. So yeah, no huge grand plans currently, but yeah.
And a very simple question: what was your go-to boat race fuel? And I know the answer with Daphne, so I'll leave that for a second and start with Susanna. What was your fuel?
Saurine. Always malt loaf. Lots and lots of malt loaf.
Patrick?
Honestly, like, it's a balance between eating well and eating conveniently, because you don't have a huge amount of time. So you can have these grand plans of cooking like a really healthy meal every evening, because that's kind of the best thing to do. But if that means you sacrifice an hour's sleep in doing that, then it's not necessarily the best thing to do. So I think actually a huge mixture, depending on, you know, sometimes you do have to make and I think that's the general challenge of being a student athlete rather than just an athlete, is you do have to make sacrifices. So, you know, post rowing, hot cross buns were great, malt loaf as well, but like just more generally, I think try to be as healthy as possible, but accept that sometimes compromises are going to have to be made because sleep is more important or whatever.
And Daphne?
I think I was always known for my very healthy obsession with kale.
Exactly, kale.
So people would always know me for that. But you know, when it's boat races week and you're living with the squads, at least on the women's team, we cooked our own dinners and we alternated who from the boat was lead on cooking for each night. So you know, we always had healthy options, but it was also a really great bonding experience to see everyone's level of cooking expertise. And I have very fond memories of in 2015 trying to make a butternut squash risotto with Holly Hill and failing terribly. We all ate it and it was still good, but I think it was more of a porridge than it was a risotto.
And I have to admit, yesterday I went to a really early morning with Krispy Kreme donuts, very large trays, and a few oranges and nuts so that it would look slightly healthy. But everyone eats the Krispy Kreme donuts. And when I arrived there, the BBC were all outside with their outside broadcast vans. And the helicopter, the drones, and the quad bikes were there. But I should at this point just mention that the boat race on Sunday, which takes place at 3:50 for the women and 4:50 for the men, is a no spectator sport. So please watch on BBC One with programmes starting at 3 o'clock, but don't go to view, because the police have said, there's an article here in the Daily Mail which reads, "Shock and awe, £200 if you watch the boat race, fine if you watch the boat race from the Ouse riverbank." So very different this year because of COVID restrictions. We have to keep the crews safe and all the support staff. So I took the Krispy Kreme donuts and wore my Cambridge mask at the time. So we're all trying to abide by the rules as well as we can. And a very complex question from Tim Brown. Were any physiological measurements taken to assess athletic potential, heart rate monitoring, and was blood sampling used? And I think the time and the year that you rode the boat race may influence your answers. So, Susanna, you were in the early years. Did that apply then?
Yeah, back in the 1920s. So I rode my races 2009. We did some testing, a little bit, but not a great deal. Not really using heart rate monitors regularly or anything like that particularly. It may have been different in the men's squad at that point, I'm not sure, but no, nowhere near as much, just sort of monitoring physiology through rowing machine testing rather than through actually physiology monitoring.
Patrick?
Yeah, we heart rate was pretty standard. We did quite a lot of blood lactate testing. So you'd say you're doing a 3 by 25 minute erg. You have a 1 minute break after each one, and you'll stagger so that the coaches can prick everyone's ear in that 1 minute break, and then they take a little glass capillary tube, fill it with your blood, put it in a sample, and put it in the machine, and it gives you a blood lactate reading, which kind of assesses effectively, how hard you're working. I think all of that it has a place. I think there's also a lot to be said for just how you're feeling, if that makes sense. I could have days when I'd be feeling incredible, and the coaches would come back and be like, "Oh, your lactate's pretty high, you should probably go easily." And I'd have days when I'd be feeling abysmal, and I'd be feeling, this is so hard today, and they'd be like, "Yeah, your lactate's pretty low, you should probably work a bit harder." And you'd be like, "Oh, wow, I was not hoping for that answer." So it is quite like, there is a fair degree of science in it, but I think however scientific you want to make it, you've also just got to listen to your own body, and how you feel is a pretty good metric of how to train, basically.
Oh, thanks very much. And Daphne, just a short answer because we're coming to the end.
Yes, just briefly, every morning we would have to record our waking heart rate, our weight. So that was a daily metric that was taken. And then we, again, take our heart rates at the end of pieces and see how we were recovering a minute afterwards, how our heart rate was coming down. So heart rate was a big thing. And then we also did the blood lactate testing like Patrick spoke about.
Thank you. And thank you all, audience, for joining us. And very great thanks to Patrick, Daphne and Susanna, but also to Emma, Sarah, Corinne in the alumni office who've organised all this, Nigel and Ian in the computer office, all the people in Maudlin, Paul Knights, Perrin, everyone, Henry Reynolds, who's the chairman of the club, all the people who sit on committees, for being such massive supporters of Maudlin rowing. And grateful thanks to you all. But we all send our best wishes and prayers to those light blue rowers who on Sunday will be representing Cambridge, and we hope that they win. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Thanks to you, Pat, as well for
yeah, thanks so much to
Thank
Pat
you so much.
for your continued work for Maudlin and the university. Both of those things, you know, there's absolutely no reason you need to do any of that, and yet you continue to give your time incredibly generously. So I know on behalf of everyone at Maudlin and at Cambridge University Boat Club, they're very, very grateful. So thank you very much.
Thank you.